What I'd like to say
love reading
is,
transcripts.
I've never seen anything.
It's very boring read. This one is.
Why do people
The other ones are more.
disclaimer there.
Full disclaimer. This isn't as exciting as Oliver North or the Kennedy.
I'm
or,
trying to keep it cool?
Holly, yeah, the thing with Holly is we weren't sure we believed what he said.
I didn't
so
think they
thank
were
for good
Oh,
reading it that way.
yeah.
Like, what is he really
And
reading?
everybody has a right to speak.
He's talked a lot.
Yeah.
Everybody here, yep.
That would be his word, yes.
Okay, I'll go ahead and press the button.
Saying that he was one of those under those Americans that went down there to do.
Go ahead if you're ready. You can start. I press the button.
All right,
I don't know if he ever recovered.
call the meeting to order. Good evening, this is the regular meeting of the Architectural Board of Review. I'm going to call the roll, Mike?
Sure. Member Callahan?
Here.
Member Dahlman?
Here.
Member Kerouac?
Here.
Member Russ?
Here.
Member Waymeyer?
Here.
Chair Hunter?
Yep.
And Member Deegan is absent, and we have Village Attorney Ben Schuster joining us.
Okay, first item of business is the, second item of business actually is the minutes of October 2nd. Anybody have any comments, corrections, thoughts?
Looked good to me.
That's a thought, okay.
I move the minutes be approved as submitted.
Second. No more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That one's gone. Okay, at this point, we allocate some time for anybody in the audience that would like to speak on something that is not on the agenda, and if so, raise your hand. Okay. All right, we'll move on then to the main topic, which is item number 4 on the agenda, the discussion and possible decision of the Architectural Board of Review in the appeal regarding the application for a significant demolition permit for 419 East Prospect Avenue. Ben, can I ask you to explain why we're doing this why it's the ABR's responsibility to?
Sure. So under the Village Code, Section 9-1-24, subsection D provides that a decision by the building commissioner on an interpretation under this section or on the application of a provision of this title may be appealed to the Architecture Board of Review by filing a written application for an appeal with the village administrator. So the village administrator has received an appeal from 10 residents regarding whether the demolition application for 419 East Prospect Avenue is complete. Because those provisions fall under Title IX of the Village Code, the jurisdiction is with this body to hear appeals. For example, if this was a zoning decision, that would be appealed to the PCZBA. But because this is a building code issue, it comes here.
Okay, thank you. All right, I assume that Mr. Nguyen is going to be the appellant, that you'd like to make your presentation at this point? Okay.
But one thing we always ask everybody to keep in mind is we are on local cable television. So even though we can hear what people say without the microphones, people at home can only hear what you say into the microphone. So it's best to speak into them.
Okay, that should be good.
Yep.
I am Ed Nguyen. I'm one of the appellants regarding this matter tonight, and I live at 502 East Prospect. Thank you for your time in considering this appeal. Before I get into the facts and the merits of our appeal, we'd like to put some things in context. First, we appreciate the fact that we are here challenging the decision of the village administrator / building commissioner. And we would not do that unless two things. First, we had discussed our issues with the village with both the village administrator, building commissioner, and the village attorneys on several occasions in an attempt to reach a resolution short of filing this appeal. Secondly, we believe that the issues that we are raising are both significant and important. We also understand that this appeal may put this board in an uncomfortable position. Because we're asking you to review a decision by a village official, and this is a village board. And one of the members, Mr. Deegan, is an architect for the specific permit application that's at issue in our appeal. To be clear, while we agree that Mr. Deacon should, as he's agreed to, recuse himself from the consideration of or being part of the decision in this appeal, we also would like to emphasize the following, that this appeal does not in any way contend that Mr. Deacon has done anything other than be a strong advocate and professional representative of the permit applicant. We'd also like to be clear about what this appeal isn't. It's not just another delay tactic to prevent the demolition of 419 East Prospect, one of the oldest houses in Lake Bluff. It's also not personal. Either as to the village staff, the village attorneys, or as to the owner of 419 East Prospect who applied for the demolition permit. And it's not about seeking damages from the village. And perhaps most importantly, it's not just about a single demolition permit for a single property here in Lake Bluff. For sure, the set of facts that are involved in this appeal involve that demolition permit. This appeal is about something more significant, though, and more fundamental, the rule of law. And specifically, whether the building commissioner or any other government official here in Lake Bluff, the community we all call our home and treasure, should ever be allowed to take the position that he or she has the discretion not to follow the requirements of the law and that no one can do anything about it. For that reason, the relief we are requesting is focused and limited. We simply ask that the building commissioner follow the requirements of the Lake Bluff Municipal Code and make sure that, as the code requires, the significant demolition application comply with those requirements before it can lawfully be deemed complete and approved. That's it. Today of all days is an appropriate time for this body, to the entity the code has established, to review the decisions of the building commissioner, to consider the issues raised in our appeal. Today, as we all know, is Election Day, a day that is fundamental in our democratic system, a day where we, the people, hold our elected government leaders accountable. But elections are just one of the ways we hold our leaders accountable. One of the other ways is the rule of law. Simply put, it means that we as a nation and as a state and as a community believe that we are governed by the law, that the laws must be followed, and that no one is above the law. So what are the facts here? The facts, which are set out in the timeline that was included in our appeal, are these. On July 19th, 2018, the day after the night his subdivision request was rejected by the PCZBA, the applicant submitted this application for a demolition permit. The application was accepted by the village and deemed to be complete, even though it did not include the three principal components of that application under the code: the demolition site management plan, the fee, or the bond. The only way we discovered that the plan had not been submitted was as a result of my asking for that plan on August 16th, 2018. Actually, I thought it had been filed. My purpose was to see how it addressed issues that are likely to affect me and the other neighbors who filed this appeal. And in fact, it's the same three issues that we have before you tonight as to how the application, as to why the application is not complete: protection of our trees, protection of our health and safety, and protection of our properties. The only way we discovered that the application had not included the fee and the bond was a result of a September Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, request. Now let's stop there for a moment. This was what was extraordinarily troubling when we learned that the building commissioner had declared the application complete, even though these three principal components were missing. How could that be? And if those three components were missing, what did that say about the review process? What did it say about whether the building commissioner was fulfilling his obligations under the municipal code to protect all residents of the village? And what did it say about whether the building commissioner was protecting us as adjoining neighbors from the potentially negative effects of the proposed demolition. And so I dug further. And as I did, I realized, and have continued to realize, the building commissioner failed to fulfill his code-required duty to review the application and ensure that it was complete. And his reason for not doing so? That's what has been the most surprising and completely unexpected part of this process. He has contended, and the village attorneys continue to contend, that he doesn't have to, and that no one can do anything about it. That's why they filed a motion, in essence, to dismiss this appeal. This response and what has happened during this process are truly stunning when viewed objectively in the light of the full set of facts. And before I discuss that, I want to be very clear about something. I recognize that reasonable, well-intentioned people make mistakes. None of us are perfect. When I make a mistake, if I realize it, I acknowledge it and try to make it right. That's what reasonable, well-intentioned people do. And if I haven't realized I've made a mistake, I want somebody to bring it to my attention so I can correct it. I believe people ought to have a reasonable opportunity to correct mistakes that are brought to their attention. And that's exactly what we've done here. I first brought the deficiencies in the demolition application at issue, not to this body, not to the courts, not to the media, but directly to the village and specifically to the building commissioner, village administrator. And why did I do that? Again, I believe it's the right thing to do, to give someone who's made a mistake an opportunity to correct it and move on. I don't believe in unnecessary escalation, and the record here would clearly and unequivocally demonstrate that that I have personally given, the building commissioner multiple opportunities to correct any errors and ensure that he acts in accordance with the law. In fact, it's the response to our documenting and presenting these errors that is so troubling and, quite frankly, so hard to understand. If, in fact, after these errors were presented to him, the building commissioner's response was something like, as much as I don't like it, we didn't do what we should have done here, we'll make it right, we'll refocus our efforts on getting the application to comply with the code and be complete so the clock can legally start. If he had said that, we wouldn't have been here. We wouldn't be here tonight. But we are, and here's why. Rather than focusing on correcting clear errors in the process and the completeness of the application, the building commissioner doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down on defending his errors. First, the building commissioner tried to hide that he failed to follow the law. Tipped off by my request that the demolition site management plan, tipped off by my request for the demolition site management plan, staff determined that it hadn't received the fee or the bond either, and it didn't say anything to me, quietly arranging directly with the applicant to get those things in. It only revealed to me that the demolition site management plan had now been filed. And I think, and the facts and the timeline here would support this, that the village administrator thought we would go away, that we'd never find out that the fee or the bond had also not been submitted. But my experience and intuition told me something wasn't right. And when I couldn't get answers on my questions informally, I used the FOIA process to find out what was going on. And that's when I found out that the village hadn't gotten the fee or the bond, and I believe also tried to hide that fact from the Historic Preservation Commission when they were asked why the clock was reset. But here's what I also found. They fudged the completion date. They declared the application complete as of August 24th, even though when they reviewed it and they determined that it needed additional information, and they didn't receive that information until 5 days after they declared the application complete. And let me be very clear here. The only way that this would ever have been discovered, just like the only way of the failure of the building commissioner to require the 3 principal elements of the application clearly required by the code, was because of my request for the plan, followed by 2 FOIA requests. One thing that my experience also tells me is that when someone who is informed of a mistake in a process isn't transparent about one thing, they're likely not to be transparent about other things. So I submitted another FOIA request that helped me get at that. And what I discovered is in the timeline that's in the exhibit to our appeal. Here's what it showed. Even though the applicant is himself a professional architect and developer, he started this process by asking the village about hiring someone in the village as his architect. What the records reflect is that the village staff appropriately declined to provide that information, but what the record also shows is that he hired Mr. Deegan, a member of this board, the very next day after that response. What the record also shows is that Mr. Deegan was being pressured by the applicant to start the clock for the required Historic Preservation Commission review of the application after the PCZBA refused his request to subdivide the property. In fact, the record shows the applicant filed the demolition application, as we discussed, the morning after the evening that the PCZBA denied a subdivision request. That the village accepted the plan and deemed it complete on July 19, 2018, again without the plan, the fee or the bond, and even worse, without the village's own required questionnaire, which was not even submitted until almost 2 weeks after the village initially deemed the application complete. After my request for the plan, Mr. Deegan, in an email to the applicant and others the applicant had hired, stated, and I quote, "I am getting pressure from the client. The village will not start the 120-day countdown until after the demo plan has been received," unquote. And then, after that, there are several emails in which the applicant insistently demands whether the clock has started, and the village responds that it has, and that that fact has been confirmed by the village attorney, even though, at that time, the village was still requesting information from the applicant to make the application complete. This process, unfortunately, was tilted and has been tilted in favor of the applicant. Whether it was the village staff sharing residents' comments directly with the applicant and conferring with him about those comments, but not the other way around, or telling the applicant they would have the village attorney come to the September 12th HPC meeting, the only meeting the attorney had attended up to that point, to, quote, speak to issues residents raised, and thereby help the applicant. Or more recently, the village attorneys preparing a one-sided, incomplete, and misleading motion to dismiss our appeal, representing it as an unbiased analysis of our appeal. Its bias was made apparent by the village attorneys preparing findings and conclusions for the board, dismissing the appeal, even before the board hears this appeal tonight. In fact, because of the very short review period that I had to prepare a reply, I was able to, as you know, include, and I included full copies of all the cases that I cited. I did not get an opportunity to provide an analysis of all the cases cited by the village attorneys. I've done this in a 3-page chart that I'd like to pass out to each of the members so you can see the basis. I've read each of those cases, and if any of you would like to read any of those cases, I have all of them with me, and I'm glad to provide those to you. And as part of this process, I also learned that the applicant referred to me as malicious or as a rat to the village in some of these emails. Although no one likes to be called names, I've learned not to be emotionally triggered by these things. Though I do believe that when a party digresses to name-calling, there's something more to the story. There's an old legal adage that goes this way: when you have the facts, pound the facts. When you have the law, pound the law. And when you have neither, pound the table. But perhaps the best summary of what was going on is in the applicant's own words in a voicemail received in response to my FOIA request, and I quote, "I would expect someone paying attention to stuff would mete these things out like Chinese water torture," unquote. Obviously, the applicant and perhaps staff knew they weren't paying attention to the rules and had not expected anyone else to be paying attention. But we were, and we are. Although I can't prove it definitively at this point, I think a fair and reasonable inference from the facts discovered in response to my FOIA request is that the applicant was rushing to start the HPC clock, that he was putting pressure on the village to accept an admittedly and knowingly incomplete application to start the clock, and that none of them liked it when it was discovered. In the first meeting with the building commissioner and assistant village attorney, Mr. Schuster, after the response to the FOIA request, the building commissioner started with the defense that he has maintained to this day, that he had the power to decide not to follow the requirements of the code and that we couldn't do anything about it. Specifically, he said, quote, "You got the clock restarted already, and you've got the HPC considering your landmark request. You should feel good. What's the harm?" Well, if those who know me well were in the room when this was said, there might have been an audible gasp. I don't react well to political positioning, and I don't react well when people try to avoid the facts and the law. Never have, never will, and I didn't then. And it caused me to dig deeper. But as I said, I always believe in giving people a chance to correct a mistake. So I went through the code carefully. It didn't take that long, maybe an hour or so, to identify all the requirements that make a significant application complete. And it was then I discovered that there were additional significant deficiencies in the application beyond the initial failure to submit the plan, the fee, or the bond that had a real effect on me and the other neighbors who are bringing this appeal. And I presented one of those to the building commissioner, the failure to have the tree survey submitted with the plan to include all trees that are required to be part of that survey, and especially the trees that are close to the property line where the proposed demolition would occur. But he rejected that, and he did two things. First, as he had done in the meeting, he maintained his position that he could decide not to follow the requirements of the code and that we couldn't do anything about it. Second, the building commissioner attempted to prevent the board from reviewing his decision that the application was complete. And here's how that went. As I had done previously when I submitted the original appeal, this is one you didn't see, I gave the building commissioner / village administrator an opportunity to reconsider his position on the issue I raised in the appeal, the protection of nearby trees. But instead of resolving that issue, he, one, identified a completely different minor issue with the application involving site access that he could quickly and quietly resolve with the applicant. Two, reset the clock based on that issue. And then, three, because he had done that, he declared my appeal moot, which is legal lingo for resolved, even though it wasn't, because he explicitly rejected the basis for my appeal. And based on that, he refused to provide my original appeal to this board. Yet, rather than exercise other rights I might have had at that point, I once again gave the building commissioner an opportunity to change his position. And once again, he declined, maintaining his position that he wasn't required to follow the requirements of the code and that we couldn't do anything about it. And I gave him a final opportunity to correct his errors, and I laid out to him and to the village attorney the timeline, the same one you have in front of you, the index of the documents I received in response to my FOIA request, the one also attached as an exhibit to the appeal, so we could have a discussion based on the facts. In that discussion, I was assured that the process was sloppy, but not intentional. I accepted that representation. I decided I would provide the building commissioner with the remaining deficiencies in the application rather than addressing them one at a time. And I also provided him with a checklist, the same checklist I had developed, of the requirements of a significant demolition application. Now let's be clear about this. If our primary goal was to delay this application as long as possible, I would never have identified all of those at once. I would have identified those one at a time, and each time the building commissioner refused to require the correction of each deficiency, I would have filed an appeal with this board. But relying on the village administrator's representation that the process was just sloppy and not intentional, I not only provided the building commissioner with all of the deficiencies promptly after our meeting, I also gave him a checklist to assist him in ensuring the completeness of the application and other applications. And as to the checklist, The reason I did that is when I first asked the village administrator about why so many things were missed in the review of the application, and I asked, didn't they use a checklist? He said they didn't, and in fact, they didn't have one. 2 days after that meeting, the building commissioner, although not specifically addressing these additional significant deficiencies, told me I could add them to this appeal. And I did that, since the building commissioner informed me that the appeal had not yet been sent to the board. Now, we now know, based on the village attorney's memo to the board, that the building commissioner, having been made aware yet again of the significant failures of the application to comply with code requirements, maintains his position that he is not required to enforce those requirements and that we can't do anything about it. And now he goes so far as to contend that the applicant, by omitting required items, can prevent a review of the application as to those required items. Stunning, truly stunning. We believe this appeal provides clear, convincing, and incontrovertible facts and cites clear, unambiguous provisions of the code that together demonstrate that the significant demolition application remains incomplete and that therefore the HPC clock has yet to begin to run. Again, this isn't about just a single demolition application, nor about relying on technicalities to delay the demolition. It's about whether the village respects the rule of law and whether it will hold its officials accountable for respecting the rule of law and complying with the village ordinances. If the village believes the ordinances should be different, then amend them, as they most recently did in 2016 as to the building code, and be accountable to residents for those changes. But until then, the rule of law, fundamental fairness, and due process require that the village administrator and his staff follow and enforce the ordinances as they exist today. Finally, let's be clear about one other thing. The building commissioner's statement in the papers that were filed as part of the packet on Friday, suggesting that the board could just not act, and after 15 days, the appeal would be deemed denied. What would that mean? Why do he and the village attorneys highlight that in the memos to this board? Let me answer those questions also very directly. And although I've wanted to think otherwise, I've come to accept that this is just yet another way that the building commissioner hopes to avoid anyone reviewing what he and his staff did here and how it doesn't comply with the village code and the law. Even if it is just sloppiness, it's still inexcusable, and it has to be corrected, not just brushed under the rug and accepted. Here are the 11 key facts that lead me to that conclusion. Some of these we talked about, but most of these are new. First, the village administrator and or his staff hid the fact that the application didn't have the 3 required elements for a demo permit. 2, when challenged on one of those requirements, they quickly got all 3 missing required items in and tried to hide the fact that they didn't get the other 2. 3, they told the HPC the reason the clock was reset was based on a technical issue, rather than reveal the real reason they were forced to reset it. 4, they fudged the date that they received the items they requested until they were called out on it based on a FOIA request. And when they were called out on their date fudging, the village administrator said, "What's the harm? It's only 5 days." 5, when we initially tried to file an appeal to the board, he found a minor issue with the application he had already approved and got it the same day, reset the clock, and refused to provide that first appeal to this board, claiming because he found something else and reset the clock, the appeal about the significant issue we raised was moot. 6, he set the lawyers after us so they could find a way to thwart our appeal to this board. 7, even though they had our appeal for more than a month, yes, that is correct, the appeal that's in the packet you received Friday was submitted to the village administrator weeks ago. They didn't present it to the board until the lawyers could draft a response. And they didn't provide us that response until the same time you received it on Friday, late in the afternoon, so that we'd only have 2 weekend days to research and write a memo in response. No doubt they thought there'd be no way we'd be able to get a response done in 2 days over the weekend, but we did. 8, they positioned the lawyer's response as unbiased advice, even though it's clearly not, including containing a draft order which goes only one way, against us. 9, they put one of the lawyers who wrote the response, Mr. Schuster, on the bench with the board to advise the board regarding the appeal, including during the board's deliberations. 10, they wrote a legal memo that makes things so complicated, no doubt thinking that the non-lawyer members of this board would have no choice but to punt, which is the same as we just realized as of denying the appeal. And they made sure to highlight that in the materials you received as part of this meeting. 11, they cited cases that are no longer good law, completely irrelevant, and that are twist and distort the language of the village code, all while maintaining the position they have continued to take in this matter. We don't have to follow the law. We can make the law say whatever we want it to say, and you can't do anything about it. I never ever thought this is where we'd get to in Lake Bluff, but it is, and it's only going to get worse. Because you see, if you don't stop this now, do you think anyone else is ever going to challenge the village again to make sure they do the right thing and follow the law? Do you think if you deny this appeal, the village administrator is going to tighten up his review processes, or will he take advantage of the fact that he doesn't have to? And if he didn't do the right thing with all this scrutiny, what do you think he will do when there is no scrutiny? And who in their right mind would even bother trying to hold the village administrator accountable after this, since it would be very clear that the village administrator doesn't have to follow the law, can refuse to enforce village ordinances, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Although we've presented you with a lot of information, I would respectfully suggest that the decision you have in front of you is a simple one. Whether you support and feel comfortable defending to your constituents, we the people of Lake Bluff, the village administrator's clear failure to follow the law and using a biased process as a weapon against us, or whether, on the other hand, you support the principles of fundamental fairness, substantive and procedural due process, and perhaps most importantly, on this election day, the rule of law, the principle that requires all of us to follow the law and that no one is above the law. Thank you for your time and your consideration of these important issues. I'm glad at this time to answer any questions you may have about our appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen. Anybody else in the group like to make a comment? Drew?
There's one, yep.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
My name is Jenny Barthold. I'm one of the applicants. I'm one of the appellants. Is that the right word? Appellant? Oh, appellant. Okay. I live at 415 East Prospect, just west of 419. The proposed demolition of the old house on that property would take place only 8 feet from my house. 8 feet. I have 2 concerns: that my old trees, especially the oaks, will be compromised, that hazardous wastes, and number 2, that hazardous wastes released by the demolition will be harmful to my health. Apparently, the village of Lake Bluff takes these kinds of concerns seriously because they are covered in the application for a demolition permit. What am I to think then, when it turns out that my trees and my health are disregarded by the village's building commissioner? Disregarded completely. Disregarded to favor Mr. Helle, who bought the property next door to mine and whose plans for it keep changing. The application for demolition at 419 was declared complete without the required attention to trees and hazardous wastes. So I find myself thinking that the village doesn't really care about the welfare of its residents, that it prefers to grease the path of development at the expense of its residents. I have to tell you, I am becoming pretty cynical about the village's professed support of its residents, and I've lost my faith that Lake Bluffs is committed to its own ordinances and requirements when these are inconvenient to developers. When I wondered what to expect from this meeting tonight, I looked up the website of Lake Bluff's Architectural Board of Review, and the first thing I saw in bold type stated that, quote, "The purpose of the Architectural Board of Review is to promote and protect the public health, safety, and welfare of the village." So apparently, I brought my concerns to the right place tonight. I'm at the right meeting of the right board, and I hope that you will require that the application for demolition of the house 8 feet from me be completed. I hope that my, quote, "health, safety, and welfare," unquote, will be, quote, "protected," unquote. And I hope I'll leave this meeting with restored trust in Lake Bluff's governing individuals and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Stephanie?
My name is Stephanie Bjork. My husband and I own 414 East Prospect, directly across the street from 419. My concerns go back further than what Mr. Nguyen has stated. In the summer of 2017, I was noticed on this property that there were significant changes in play. I asked to go, went into Village Hall, asked to see the plans, and was told they wouldn't be ready until the Friday before the meeting, and so I waited and went in. I was told by Mr. Cole that the application had been withdrawn, it was not complete, and that if there was anything more that came down the line, I would be noticed again. That didn't happen. A year went by. I assumed that nothing had happened, and when this issue was raised with the timeline of this time that Mr. Nguyen is speaking of, I went back through the old minutes, and I realized that there had been an extensive discussion after I was told that Friday afternoon that it had been pulled from the agenda. There was an extensive discussion, not only at that meeting, but at several other meetings where it was called a workshop. So bypassing the notice requirements to me. At that point, for that year, I had never met the Nguyen's. I knew them as the people that walked Rusty the dog that my husband always gave treats to. But we were neighbors, respectful of each other. But subsequent to that, I've met several neighbors that I had not really even known names of other than to wave and say hello. So this is an extremely disturbing situation for us to be drawn into. My concern at this point, and was originally in 2017, we hired engineers and surveyors to do a topographical and to do a study for the drainage issues that we knew were in place, given that Prospect did not have any storm sewers, and we knew that the infrastructure was woefully inadequate already at that point. So we had all of that drawn up. I've given that to the village in the interim to show them that our experts absolutely believe that anything on that site beyond what's there right now requires addressing in terms of services. And so apart from the issues that Mr. Nguyen raised, this summer, when the water table was raised, our home at 414 broke in half. We had apparently raising of the water table underneath the house, and both the walls and the floor, which the village has been made a part of and well aware, has been extensively damaged. So we've tried very hard to work with the village to try to resolve our issues in the proper ways. And And it seems like these concerns have gone completely unaddressed, to the point that there really does seem, in my mind, Mr. Nguyen asked for a FOIA on the drainage issues that were in play, and I don't believe that we've received really a complete answer to that. So we're left with, we personally, my husband and I, are left with great concerns as to how this plays out for us. And whether our original 1870s camp meeting cottage, really one of the last ones on the 25-foot plat dated back, matters. Because we're stuck with a lot of limitations in putting this properly back together with the complete intent on our part, as I think the village will tell you, to do this with their full knowledge and permission and cooperation and permitting and that type of thing. But we're literally looking at situations around us where work starts with no permits, and then permits are issued after the fact. And all of this impacts us. We've replaced now our sump pumps, really top-end battery backup systems and sump pumps twice, because they're cycling about every 5 seconds. So they're burning out. So that either the water table's that high or something horrible has happened, but we're not getting any answers. And we're really at a distinct limitation on how we can address that as a homeowner on a street with no storm sewers and no understanding of what our options are and no real answers. It's difficult. I understand that. I understand the board is in a difficult position, but we had a year of not knowing that there were extensive discussions going on, that we had raised these issues in 2017 about being concerned about drainage, concerned about services, concerned about how it was going to impact all of us, and it's not just our house. We know of 3 houses that received structural damage in the storm this summer. So we've had FEMA engineers out, and I appreciate your time. I understand, as Mr. Nguyen does, that this is an extremely difficult situation that everybody's in. But this is where we're at. And so we all need to try to go forward the right way, doing the right things for everybody. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Stephanie. Anybody else? Okay. Drew, would you like to state your case?
Thank you. I'm Drew Irvin. I'm the village administrator / building commissioner. I have been for the last 10 years, and I think I know all of you around the table. I just met Mr. Callahan tonight for the first time. I know most of the folks here. I wanted to respond to some of the comments that Mrs. Bjork just made, talking about response to all the FOIAs. And let me back up a little bit. So we believe we follow the law. As Mr. Nguyen pointed out, I believe at times it was done in a very sloppy way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and how the initial applications regarding the 419 East Prospect significant demolition permit were managed by my staff. There was problems with that, and we've made some internal process changes to address that in the future. And I'll walk through where Mr. Nguyen and I have disagreed about when the application was actually complete, and I'll walk through why my determination of that and how I arrived at that decision. And I'll also try to talk to some of the misunderstandings that were happening when Mr. Nguyen and myself and other village officials had met on and off, including Mr. Ben Schuster and the village president, Kathleen O'Hara, as we went through this, the questions that Mr. Nguyen launched throughout the last several weeks or months at this point. But again, I'll start off by saying, again, I think we believe we follow the law, and we've also treated this particular application just as we treated others and how we interpreted the village's code. So this particular application, while it was, I agree, sloppily handled in the beginning, we did interpret it as we've always interpreted the codes and treated it with regards to how we review the significant demolition application requirements and how we review each of those individual ones. So he was treated, Mr. Helly's application was treated, I guess our interpretation of the code in the same way we've done every other one in other demolition permit applications, and trying to be practical and reasonable in our review of applications of this nature. So first, back to some of the comments Mrs. Bjork made. So she made a comment about the village's handling permits that were issued after the fact, or addressing those. I'm just going to try to take care of some of these little issues quickly. Those were brought to the village's attention. I think one of our neighbors was doing some construction work without a permit that hadn't been reviewed, brought it to our attention, we addressed it, got a permit. So that's not uncommon, it's not ideal, but it's not uncommon. We have been talking with Mrs. Bjork and her husband regarding the stormwater in and around her subdivision with all the recent stormwater downpours that we've been experiencing around the area. We've had a lot of similar questions throughout the village at different areas and been dealing with all those projects and to address those in terms of new infrastructure projects, and also dealing with questions from some engineers she has been working with and trying to develop a plan to address these, just as we would with other folks. And I don't think there's been a permit submitted yet for that work. Of course, we'll handle that and treat it with the respect that it deserves. So let me start off and try to keep this very simple. Again, we reviewed the village's code and how we handle, I'm going to use this PowerPoint so if you can see this and follow along with me. So what we're talking about here is a significant demolition application, and that is any application for a demolition permit that proposes to destroy or remove in whole or in part at least 50% of the gross floor area of a structure or building originally constructed 50 years or more prior to the date on which the building official deems the application complete, and B, that proposes in whole or in part to destroy, alter, or otherwise change the exterior elements or appearance of the structure or building. That's what we were dealing with here. So don't think there's debate about that. When is an application complete? Only after the requirements have been, as outlined in the code, have been provided, which includes payment of all applicable fees, a site management plan, and deposits. And there is a little provision in there. It talks about we can allow an application of this nature to be deemed complete, even if it doesn't have utility disconnects that are supplied by your North Shore Gas, ComEd Electricity, and so forth. That usually comes very late in the process, so the code acknowledges that. And as Mr. Wynn pointed out, there were two different instances when the village, my staff, deemed this application complete, and that was wrong. There was not information there that should have been submitted, was not provided. And I got involved and reviewed that and made sure that it was, and that's when the September 28th, that's included in this memorandum that talks about when the application was actually deemed complete officially by me, and my staff did do it, so there was those miscues that the village would be viewed as saying that the application was deemed complete when it wasn't. And that was true, and I acknowledged that to Mr. Wynn, and I talked about that, and he and I had several long conversations about how our process worked, and we agreed that it could be better. And we have made changes, like I talked about. We do have a draft checklist, as Mr. Wynn has put together himself, that we are using moving forward. It's still being developed, or finalized, I should say. We're also doing that for a couple areas of the village where we have other similar lengthy application requirements. We already have one for subdivision and site plan review. We've had those for years. We just haven't had one for the HPC process yet, and we're finalizing those as well as doing those for the PCZBA requirements. So again, as I stated earlier, and as Mr. Wynn had pointed out, which we had met multiple times and talked about, that it was sloppily handled the first two times, and then we got it straight. And within all the materials, the application materials had been provided to you. I have this PowerPoint which will go through that. The payment of the fees, you can see here, the demo tax, principal structure demolition fees, and the performance bond. These are receipts that were provided in your packet showing the dates of when those were provided. I will agree with Mr. Wynn that it was sloppily handled, and the fact that his application, when he requested this information, he thought it already was provided, and it wasn't, that's true. But they were provided later, and then again on September 28th, this was deemed complete. Here is, again, this is an excerpt. All these little images that you'll see are actual snapshots of the images within your packet. This is one of the demolition site plan review sheets. That's the actual requirement number 1, which I viewed as a scaled sketch map plan of the site. So in my determination that that requirement was met by that visual there that was provided by Mr. Helly. The second requirement in the code regarding demolition site management plans requires for a depiction of on-site access routes for vehicles, equipment, and personnel. So this is on the right side of one of the plans. It talks about the driveway. There's an arrow talking about the access point. This will be used for construction access. This is a detail here in one of the lower sections of the plans talking about how the construction entrance, this is a cross-sectional drawing for civil engineers with really good eyes that can view this, but this is the requirement satisfying that, of how that will be set up. And so that clearly demonstrates that, in my view, that requirement satisfied. The third requirement is the depiction of on-site dumpsters, construction fencing, public-private utilities, stormwater management and fencing, and other devices. These are all, again, samples of how the plans and application materials satisfy this requirement. In this lower right, this catch-all, that's an actual specification for a stormwater basin, how it should be kept and managed on site to capture and manage stormwater. The lower right corner here, this is actually a private utility. This is one of the laterals that they look to abandon as part of this demolition project. Again, a private utility here, and this is the intersection outlining, this is at East Prospect and Moffett, showing the public utilities that are shown and depicted on the plan. And then up here is more details dealing with storm management on the site, all details included in notes section of these plans, and again, in my opinion, satisfying this requirement. The fourth requirement deals with the description for dust control measures. Again, the note sections of the drawings deal with this, talking about there on the right side, number 4, dust control measures should be used when applicable to minimize the spread of airborne particles. Similarly, this is on the left, deals with the notes dealing with grading issues on site, when they're using heavy equipment, and if the weather is really dry and warm, there could be dust, and again, those descriptions there describe how dust should be managed. Oops, sorry, jumping ahead. Requirement number 5 deals with the tree survey, location and size, and fencing requirements. The plans did include an inventory of the trees. Descriptions and locations and tags are shown on the drawings. It's very difficult to read this, but I know you can see it in your packet. There'd be a tree, there'd be a number corresponding to the table describing the species and the size of it and a condition and location. And also, this is a detail about how the tree protection fencing should work, again, including on the plans. The question has been risen, and this is one of the points where there's some debate about this. And again, understanding that this is a demolition site management plan that is an application requirement associated with a nomination period for historic preservation purposes. But the point of this is when you review this document, in my view as the building commissioner, this satisfied the requirement of having tree survey information and fencing sufficient enough to satisfy this requirement for the purposes as set forth in the code. And again, that's again trying to be practical and realistic with what we're dealing with here. Requirement number 6 requires site access routes and location of parking for demolition equipment, trucks, and crews. This was one of the issues that Mr. Nguyen referenced with a conversation, I think he may have referred it to, and I don't want to misquote you, Mr. Nguyen, but having to do with a technical small minor thing. This was something that after the second review, this is one of the things in my review when I went back for the review of the code letter for letter that was missing. This was that technical requirement that was not provided by the applicant that spells out very specific site access routes and so forth as required by the code. And that was something that I thought was still missing. The fact that it was not provided after the second time, I will admit, was very frustrating for me because was my understanding that everything was done. It was not. This is one I personally identified as being incomplete. And so I wanted to make sure that was included in there. I had a conversation with Mr. Helly on the phone about it, and I'll stop for a moment and talk about this a little bit. So what's interesting with this is, again, going back for the requirements associated with a demolition site management plan related to historic preservation and reviewing of a significant demolition application. And we've talked about this, and Mr. Helly made the comment, he and I had a conversation about the fact that these code requirements, in terms of where they appear in the process and sequence, are probably not the best in terms of aiding the Historic Preservation Commission in the decisions they need to make, because these are very detailed information drawings that very early in the process, which may not be relevant, and I brought this point up specifically, is that we talk about using East Center and Moffett for access. Well, most people in this room know that that's under construction presently. There's a big project in Moffett Road, they're redoing the culvert there. Significant construction project that's lasted at least 6 weeks at point. At this point, if this construction was starting today, we wouldn't tell them to start using specific access points, but we had to come up with something to address this point, and this would be in the most practical sense, knowing that down the road, if and when something does happen here, this would be a very probable route, given that both East Center and Moffett are collector streets within the village's transportation systems. So that would be a probable outcome. But I just want to point that out, that sequentially, that some of these things, staff is going to bring these to the village board and specifically talk about changes to these code requirements. But yet, and again, to meet the letter of the law, requirement number 6, it was provided, and again, it was provided on December 28th, and that was the last piece of information, in my view, that was missing to declare this complete. Number 7 talks about site-specific measures that the code wouldn't otherwise require. This is the neighbor to the west. I'm sorry, your name escapes me. Yes. Yes, thank you. Spoke earlier about her home. It is really close. In fact, there's an encroachment right here along the western border of Mr. Helly's property. There was some plan notes that speak to how to deal with or manage the stone wall and make sure that that's accounted for as part of the project. There were some plan notes, again, very specific to this site, not required otherwise by the code, but makes practical sense to address, again, early in the process. And candidly, we don't know for certain what will be built, if anything, on this site someday. If and when we do, we know that this in particular is not a demolition permit issuance. This is a permit application. And with demolition permits, we know that no matter what, they have to follow the law. So whether it be adjacent trees that may get damaged, we would have to address that. That would get addressed. Likewise, the demolition activities ultimately decided to be done, and any new construction or thinking about a new foundation being dug, that certainly would impact trees that we don't know about today and where those would fall. Potentially, probably a poor choice of words of me, but where that dig would occur. So ultimately, whatever would be submitted, we would have to look at this again and make sure that the village's rules were being followed, and that's how we do it. That's how we treat all the other applications. And this does meet, in my opinion, the requirement number 7 of getting site-specific measures to minimize adverse impacts on neighboring properties. Requirement number 8. Similar to the other requirement number 7, but this deals with any other measures or features not otherwise required to minimize adverse. This is kind of a catch-all, if you will. Again, I go back and point to these other site-specific measures that were provided to speak to, again, site-specific issues. Not necessarily anything new that we haven't already talked about, but again, that does at least in some sense address that element of requirement that the code doesn't otherwise require. And number 9, restoration plan. So any type of work you may encounter hitting village roadways or the sidewalk or other water and sewer infrastructure. The plans include very specific details about how the public roadway could be excavated as well as any damaged portions of the sidewalk, how they would be managed, and the parkway as well. Again, in my opinion, satisfying the restoration plan and schedule requirements. So, in my view, and let me be crystal clear about this, this application was handled sloppily by my staff initially, and after the third time, I hate to say that, but on September 28th, I reviewed it, and it included those items, and in my opinion, satisfied all the requirements of the code. I've had numerous conversations with Mr. Nguyen about our process and about what we're going to do to change it moving forward. And I feel good about those changes. I also, I feel like village staff will be bringing to the village board some suggested changes on how we consider historic preservation regulations and the application requirements associated with that. And I also want to say, I think Mr. Nguyen, in my view, perhaps misspoke about a misunderstanding I thought we had with regards to your appeal. We had a conversation about that with his original. He did submit an appeal early on. There was it was a conditional appeal. And in my view, the way, I think I'm not remembering exactly, but it had to do with how the clock would be reset and based off the submittal of additional documents. And that occurred, in my opinion. And as I understood it then, that his original appeal then would not be submitted. And we talked about it because that was a misunderstanding between us, because it was done via email. And sometimes there's miscommunication via an email. Some of the quotes there, Mr. Nguyen talked about, he made a comment about me saying something, what's the harm, it's only 5 days. I don't specifically remember saying that, but I will tell you that internally we talked about the difference between 5 days between, I think it was the date between the 28th and leading up to that, whether that was, what was the difference in there. And to me, I view that as, there's no reason, there is no rush until we get it right. And that was my understanding, and that's why we admittedly said that it was wrong leading up there until the 28th, and that's when we indeed found the application to be complete. So I want to make sure I check everything here. I guess the other thing I just wanted to clarify is that, again, this is an application for a demolition permit. It's not a permit issuance. So again, the clarity about no matter what happens, the applicant, the property owner still has to follow the law. And so there's always the ability when the village issues the permit to put additional conditions on any permit, but at the end of the day, there's no getting around to following the law. So that's something I just wanted to clarify for you all, and happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I do have a question about exactly that.
Okay.
So if I wanted to tear down my decrepit eyesore built in 1977, you know, something that my friends Jenny and Stephanie would be glad to see go, glad to have a demolition permit expressed, what form would I use? The same one that we have in our packet? The same application is the same form that I would use?
There is a general demolition application form, yes, that's submitted, and then if it's if a structure is of a certain age, and I don't know if I heard you clearly on how old, is it more than 50 years old?
No.
Okay, so then you
It
don't.
is not an historic home, taking that out of the equation.
Okay, so then you
We're
go down
just talking.
a different path. So it's the same general demolition permit application form that was filled out. I think it's the first
Okay,
item.
and the demolition requirements that are section 9(1)18 demolitions, and you went through them, you know, so but those would be the same for any property that was applying for demolition. But you are making a distinction about a path then where we diverge to the HPC, and I mean, it's hard to figure these things out. I know there are some towns that, you know, I mean, this appeal may go to every board by the time you're done. There are some towns that allow people to do their appeals to the boards almost simultaneously, which just
Mm-hmm.
makes my head want to explode. I don't know how you control that process in any fashion when, you know,
Mm-hmm.
this board says do one thing and another board says another thing. But
Mm-hmm.
how does a person know where to go if there's this divergence where you want HPC to make a decision with alacrity and not hold up a homeowner's private property rights, but yet you're saying it's a different way when it's not an HPC issue? I mean,
It's a
how does
different-
a person navigate that?
Yeah, well, they come to village staff and they ask, or they present a situation. Here's my home. It was built 25 years ago. What do we need to do to reach this goal of building a new home or doing an addition? And then we walk them through the process. This is the materials you need to submit. This is the associated drawings, engineering drawings, utility issues you need to address, and in reference, and it's usually spelled out very explicitly in the code, what's required, as in this case.
Yes, and you went through those pieces, yes.
Yeah. So again, there are different tracks based off the age of your home, and there's, likewise, if it was a home that was landmarked, then there's a different process that would follow. And if it's a certified landmark, then that's a different process you would follow. It just depends for residential structures what those classifications are. And every permit application is different, right? So as an example, let me go back to this. The requirement number 8 talks about description of any other measures or features not otherwise required to minimize adverse impacts. And same with this, 7 is not too dissimilar, description of site-specific measures not otherwise required to minimize adverse impacts. So there are other reference tools that the village staff would use, like our village engineer, to determine, hey, we may have observed over time that stormwater has been pooling in certain areas, and there's certain plants that look to be consistent with a wetland area. And while it may not be identified already as an isolated wetland of Lake County, we may say, you know what, you need to do a wetland delineation. And that could be a requirement we add in there for a very specific site based off knowledge that we have. And that could be a requirement that we add on to a resident, and we would advise them as such when they're going through a process or coming to us for questions. So that would be a site-specific requirement that we could ask. Similarly, other properties, the geography of them could dictate additional measures, like if you were along the lake, and you could, we could require additional materials or information regarding soils, and be concerned about how stable that area is, the integrity of the ground. And again, that would be a function of, again, a site-specific measure, but we interpret these codes in a way to help them protect those things we desire to protect pursuant to the code, whether it be preservation of historic structures or preservation of certain natural areas, whether it be wetlands or the ravines or the bluffs and so forth. So natural resources.
Okay?
I have a couple questions. Are we going around the table?
Well,
or-
not just that, I just want to make a couple of comments. Having served on the HPC for 15 years since its inception, when we get a notice that there is a demolition of application for a house that's over 50 years old, it's just that. We've gotten a notice that there's an application, period. We don't discuss whether the application is complete. We assume that we've got the application. We don't even know what is complete. And so we've probably looked at more demolition permits or demolition projects in 15 years than we have applications to be nominated. But beside, the point is, we don't get into the detail of a demolition permit at all. So we don't know. We just assume that it's going to, our job is to see if it should be demolished or should be saved if possible. Second point is, to the best of my knowledge, the owners have not, I don't know what they're gonna do on this property. If they've decided what to do with the property, I know the first thing that the HPC saw was a scheme that was developed, and I couldn't tell you how long ago that was, by Ed Deegan, And we all were pretty enthused about it. It did save parts of the house that are there. And for whatever reason, that scheme went away. So since then, we haven't seen anything. And I think some of this is I won't call it a moot point, because that's the different definition of moot than Mr. Nguyen was talking about. But since we don't know what's happening yet, we sort of seem like we have the cart before the horse. So now, we want to go around the table. Julie, you want to start? Any comments you have, one way or the
I
other?
guess I just wanted to make sure I understood when it came to the application being complete, and then what is then the next step to issue the permit? Because, for example, if you don't have the fees, then you're not gonna issue the permit without the fees. So at some point, is there checks and balances to understand if there's missing parts besides someone like Mr. Nguyen coming in and saying, hey, you're missing all this stuff? Just so I understand that. And then, once it does go, the permit's issued and then demolition does move forward, who then is enforcing that, the measures to make sure that the safety, the different items are taken care of and people aren't chopping down trees and those sorts of things are taken care of?
Yeah. So yes, there is a check and balance in that this, again, I tried to make clear, and maybe I didn't do a good job, that this was a application, it's not a permit, right? So the idea is that when the application is submitted, that it's not uncommon for, I don't know how many notes or comments you typically put on plan sets, Mike Croak, as a building code supervisor.
It varies a lot depending on the application. It could be 70 or 80, or it could be 2 or 3.
So the idea is that when permits go out the door, there's a litany of things that we review based on the codes, making sure that all the plan sets and anything that permits that are issued are satisfying the elements of the code. And so when a project leads the village, is that it's clear that the codes will be, the code requirements are included in that permit issuance and are conditions of that permit. So once the permit is released, and yes, the fees, we're not going to issue a permit without the fees. I'm trying to, there's probably a handful of exceptions to that I can think of with maybe another governmental entity or.
Right. Just to take a little more high-level overview of it, I think one of the big questions here is not whether we would get these things, but when we would get these things. This, our code with respect to this process is unusual in prescribing that everything should come in at the beginning for this type of application. That's not the normal process for a lot of other types of things. And you don't normally ask someone to pay their permit fees the day they submit their permit. Usually it's the day the permit is issued to them later, for example. So I think that's one of the issues here, is not whether, but when.
Yeah, and that's, again, something that we've talked about internally, is that we're going to suggest some changes made. But today, for the code that's here, we reviewed that, analyzed it, and said, yes, these elements that are set forth in the code explicitly have been addressed, payments have been made as required. To your final question about once in the field, how do we know these things are being done? There are various inspection milestones for projects. There's rough inspections, finals, and every trade has those little stop-offs there. There's site inspections that occur by village building officials. We also outsource enforcement efforts to Lake Forest, and that's done as well through their inspectors. So there's an inspection process that would notify us if something was not being satisfied in terms of the code or specific conditions of a plan or permit issuance. Additionally, as I pointed out earlier tonight, neighbors are great. They're great watchers of what's going on in the neighborhood. If they see something that doesn't clue us in, they could trigger an atypical inspection of a property that wouldn't be part of a standard protocol that we go out and take and identify either it's compliant with the code or it's not. So a lot of times that does catch things, just people in the field seeing something, asking a question.
Can I respond to that, please? Can I respond to your question, please?
On microphone.
So I think the question was, could we wait until the actual demolition permit is able to be approved at some point in the future to make sure that these things are done? That's the question, correct?
It wasn't necessarily could we wait for them? I'm just curious, at some point during the process, from the time that it's considered complete, at some point, are these other things going to have to come in?
I would hope so, but here's the one thing I wanted to point out on this specific topic, and I would like an opportunity to respond to what Mr. Irvin has said. If you look at the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law that the village attorney submitted, there's one issue we need to clarify, because I think it will help with your question, Member Waymeyer, is if you look at, under the appeal is moot, C4, this is what the village attorney says. The village is permitted to landmark the property or issue a demolition permit even if the demolition application is incomplete. The position that they're taking is that the building commissioner could issue a permit even without all these things being done. And there's no assurance. So let's talk about how that works. How that works is this. You have a situation that they issue the permit. We don't get notice of it. The applicant can demolish it the next day. What can we do about it? According to their position, absolutely nothing. And here's why. One, we're not going to be able to get in front of this board before the demolition would occur. Not going to happen. We're not going to even be able to get up to court to get a temporary restraining order because the demolition will have already started. But moreover, and what they've told you in this, in their legal argument, we wouldn't have standing to do it anyway. Wouldn't have standing to do it anyway because under their position, which has been maintained, and please look at, if you want all the documents that have been transmitted by email, I'm sure I can provide them to you, or Mr. Irvin can provide them to you, but they take the position that basically the only person that can challenge a permit, and the only thing that can be challenged about a permit of this nature, is if the permit is denied and the applicant is the only one that has standing to challenge it. As you can tell from their standing argument and all the other legal obstacles they put up here, they're basically taking the position as follows. We can't challenge it now, we can't challenge it ever, because we don't have standing. That's not the law of Illinois. But if we wait until the point that we get up to the actual demolition of the structure, there's no chance. So that's why these have to be done now. And the other thing, and unfortunately Mr. Irvin left it out, the completeness standard is in the code. It requires that the application be complete at the time before the HPC can start the 90-day review process. And it defines what complete means. It complies with everything in the building code. That's the issue. It's not complete. Yes, if the village board wants to change that statute, they are welcome to do that. But this is the law as it exists today, and all we're doing is asking that the village enforce it.
Can I ask a question while you're up there?
Yes.
Is your concern that the building is being demoed or how the building is going to be demoed?
It's what happens if the building is demoed, and also has the correct process been followed as part of the code. And let me explain both of those to you, Member Kuriak, if I could. Is first, the reason that we did not identify the access route is that is minor, yes. Does it make it incomplete? Drew is correct. We identified the ones that have the biggest effect on us are trees. Now, one thing to notice about that tree survey, and I don't know if we can get back to it, I don't think I can, is that it only looks at the trees on the property. It doesn't look at the trees which within the critical root zone on adjacent properties as it's required to do. So that has an effect on us. That will happen based on the demolition. And Chairman Hutter, to your point, it doesn't matter what goes up on there. What we have in front of us is a permit to demolish. You're right. We don't know what's ever going to go on there, and we couldn't challenge, we have no basis to challenge what will be built under whatever building permit is filed. We have the right, though, to challenge what is being proposed here, and it's a demolition. So that's the first part. Second part HPC process. Yeah, you may look at that as that's some type of delay, but actually, here's what happened. Based on these dates that were too soon in here, and Chairman Hunter, you'll recall in the packet that the HPC gets, the time frame under which the HPC has to consider these is very time constrained. And so in each of the packets where this project has come up, it'll state application completion date, end of 90-day review period, and then additional 30-day period if the HPC allows that. Based on those, we had to, in essence, hurry up and prepare a request for the HPC to nominate this structure as a landmark. The research, while I think it was fairly thorough, wasn't yet complete, and in fact, there are parts of that research that I'm having done at my own expense at Cornell College about William Jeffries and the Reverend King, so that we can demonstrate that the other portion, historic portion of the house that the HPC did not agree to nominate, we can go back and get that nomination. So we were deprived of that time that we would otherwise have to go and put that nomination in place, and we will be deprived of it unless you grant this appeal. So there are actual harms here. In addition to the fact, I think it's important for any public official, any board, any employee of the municipality to follow the law. And this really is about that. Yes, if we want to change the law, welcome to it. But right now, we have to deal with the law we have.
So your final goal is to get this landmark so it won't be demolished? Is that
No,
the end goal here?
So the end goal here, and I think I've said it at the HPC, and Chairman Hunter, you can check me on this, is ideally, we would like to preserve as much of the original structure and the 1883 built addition as we possibly can and have it integrated into whatever the applicant would like to build. If that's not possible, we have also said that we want to make sure that whatever is built on the property is consistent with the character of what was there. It's a Italianate house, a very unique style from 1870. I don't think there are very many left in Lake Bluff. So we would like something there that would do that. But also, we want to make sure that when that house is demolished, there's not asbestos flying everywhere. There's not lead flying everywhere from the lead-based paint. We want to make sure that Jenny's trees are protected because they are very close to that line. And I still don't understand why they were part of the survey. And let's go back to that for a second. And I'm sorry to take time on this, but I think it's important. If you saw what the village attorneys wrote in there, and I'm assuming it's Drew's position as well, they've basically now taken the position that the if necessary at the end of that phrase basically says they don't have to get a tree survey at all. So, the issue, it says, and determine if tree protection fencing is if necessary. They're basically saying you don't even have to do this. And that I can't square up. I don't know how you figure out whether or not you need tree protection fencing if you don't know where the trees are and can figure out if they're ones you need to protect. So this is the problem that we're having, and maybe it's over-lawyering on this, I don't know. But this is to the point of being ridiculous. And as to number 7 that we have up here, the position of the village attorneys is this, that what Mr. Irvin can review is limited to what's in the application. So if, in this case, Mr. Holly didn't even identify that retaining wall, the position is he couldn't do anything about it, and nor could we. I think that's ridiculous. I got to be honest with you. If the applicant can determine what measures, what, if anything, can be reviewed regarding adverse impacts of this just by putting no adverse impacts in, you're writing that out of the code. I don't get that. I don't get that. So there are other points I'll make on other topics, and I'd like an opportunity to respond to a couple other things, but I hope that answers your question.
Carol, did you have?
I don't want to, this can go on all night, I think.
Yeah.
But just really quickly, to the question about, the discretionary nature, if appropriate or not, there's projects that come in, very large lots, and they want to do some grading work or culvert or something like that. And by the letter of the law, you say, well, we need a tree survey for the entire property. Well, that's not practical. You know, where's the impact zone? We make a determination based off our experience with projects of this nature and say, where should this be required and why, and have a conversation with the applicant or owner about that. And that's how we do it. Again, trying to be practical. So hopefully that answers, or gives clarity on that point.
Actually, it does, Drew. Here's why. Because if that were the case, there are trees 3 feet from this property line that you know from the definition of critical root zone all do need to be protected. I get if it's a 20-acre property and the demolition is on 1 acre of that, you might only look at those trees there. But there's really no argument or discretion about this. The code clearly defines what trees are in the critical root zone. You do the calculations, you figure it out, you do the work. So exaggerating it by saying if there's a large property, you don't survey all the trees, that's not these facts. These facts are there are several trees, as demonstrated in my affidavit, that are very close to this property line and that all of which are within the critical root zone.
Drew, would a village arborist or someone approve the tree protection on site before work can commence on demolition?
That would be part of the permit issuance.
Right.
So,
And have you had any other site management plans or site development plans that have surveyed perimeter, outside the boundaries of the lot, showing those trees and the protection of those drip lines? Do you know?
I mean, honestly, I don't necessarily get involved in that level of review. I don't know, Mike, if you can speak to that.
I would say that would be the minority of the applications. Most of them, the plans probably don't show the trees on the neighboring lots.
That's my,
I think two things to make clear that's important, I think, here is that so number one, what we're talking about is whether an application is complete. No, just to be clear, no building demolition permit has been issued. That determination is a separate one, whether the permit should be issued. And at the moment, it cannot be under the timing in our code. But the other thing to know is that an application may be complete doesn't mean that it will be issued. Often applications for all sorts of things are rejected because they're non-compliant with the law. So if an application comes in, it may be complete. Let's say it's a liquor application for a liquor license. Application is processed, and it might be rejected because it's not compliant either under Illinois law or with our village code. Same thing here with a demolition application. The application comes in, it may be complete, and then comes back and says, we are not going to grant the permit because you haven't done X, Y, or Z. Or the way that you're showing the access to this property would be trespass over a neighbor's property, we're not going to issue the permit. So it's a different issue. The other thing I think that's important to understand is that whether or not something is part of an application does not mean that it can be ignored by the property owner or contractor. So if there's been several statements that there's nothing that can be done if this information is not provided and a demolition permit is issued, well, I don't know that that's really true under the law, that there is a responsibility of the property owner and their contractors to make sure that they are not negligent, they do not violate the law, and if they go and they do so, one, they can be liable under fines and penalties under our code. They can be liable for penalties under state law, and there might be a cause of action by a neighbor. So if a tree on a neighbor is damaged, that neighbor may have a cause of action. If water, is not properly handled and you flood your neighbor's property, there's a cause of action. So I just think it's important that what we're concentrating on is whether under the code provisions this is complete, which is in there are issues that we addressed in our memo, as well as issues of timing that have been addressed by the applicant, or by the appellant here. But I think that the issue of completeness and whether or not the permit has been issued are different issues.
If I'm, Chair Hunter, just one final thought, if it can be a final thought. The idea of earlier comments that Mr. Nguyen made, and he and I talked about this. I just want to clarify this. I mean, there was no conspiracy. Was the original applications, plural, the two before the final, were they sloppily handled? Yes. Was there any conspiracy here? Were we working with the developer, owner of the property? Only to the extent is that we work with every owner or applicant to try to prepare them so that they are ready, so when they come in front of a committee or commission or advisory board of the village, that they're prepared so that the village can make the best decision and review and achieve its policy goals. So we tried to do that. We didn't do a good job of that for Mr. Helly by saying his application was complete when it wasn't, and I apologize for that. But we feel comfortable with where it is as of September 28th. I think I've demonstrated that and explained the other issues with regards to how other interpretations of the village code, how it's been provided consistently throughout time, and depending, it's really site-specific and project-specific. So happy to answer any other questions if there are any.
And might I respond to that? So I agree with Mr. Irvin that this is hopefully not a conspiracy. I don't have any facts to believe that it is, but that's not the test or even part of your decision tonight. Even if it was just sloppy, it's not complete. And if it's not complete, the review period doesn't start. That's clear under the code. We all may wish that to be different. It may need to be a different process. We may need to work on that, but under the current code, the laws that exist today, for that 90-day period to begin, the application must be complete. And as addressed in the appeal, it's very clear what the statute, what the code says on that. To be complete, it has to comply with all the requirements of the building code. It has to. There's no deference or wiggle room to that at all. And the only one is this, and it's the one that Mr. Irvin highlighted, which is that about the shutoffs for the utilities. When a statute provides flexibility in one regard, but doesn't provide it in others, it means those are requirements. And if you look at the most recent change that was made to the building ordinance, even for non-significant demolitions, the tree survey must be done. And it's clear in that amendment that it applies not just to the trees that are on the property, but to the trees that are off the property. And that's very, very important. So the issue you have in front of you tonight is this. Not whether there's a conspiracy. We're not arguing that. It's whether the application is now complete. We may all wish that the statute were different, but this is the statute that's part of the village code right now. And so what we're asking is that the applicant be required to comply with it. That's it.
Neil, thoughts?
I don't have any questions because it will be another 20 minutes of answers. But I do have some comments. I think it just seems.
That's going to lead to.
It just seems to me that in this process, the people who may be being hurt by this are the Hellies. If the delay is granted, they're the ones that are going to be hurt by this. As far as the application, the site management plan is concerned, Mr. Irvin has gone through the 9 things that are required, plus the amount of money that had to be submitted. And the code is very clear in that it says, and I read directly from the code, the date on which the building official deems the application complete is the application completion date. And he did that on September 28th. To change that at this point is very injurious to the Hellies. And I think that if the neighbors, there's no question in my mind that the work done by the village was sloppy, and it should have been handled in a more straightforward manner. However, that's not the Helly's fault. They didn't ask that it be done sloppily. They didn't participate in it in that manner. And I suspect that if this project goes forward, first of all, it's going to be before the village board on Monday regarding the HPC designation. The waiting period goes through at least the end of the year and probably to the end of January. So I just think the process is in order, and I suspect that the neighbors are going to be watching everything that's done on that site very carefully, and will be letting their feelings be known. So that's my comment.
Tim?
I just have a question about the affidavit that was presented to Mr. Nguyen. How did you determine the measurements that you did determine for the trees on the adjacent property?
Yeah, so I use the provision of the code that defines critical root zone. So you have to measure it at, and I'm recalling, could look at my affidavit, but I followed that precisely. You find what the diameter is at the breast height, which is a certain distance
4.5
up
feet.
the trunk, correct, 4.5 feet. Then I took a tape measure and measured that for each of those trees after I did the calculation of where I should measure it. And then based on that, it's, the calculation of the critical root zone is formulaic. I think it's 1 foot for every inch is the correct thing. So that's how I determined that.
Do you know the species of those trees at all? Are they oak?
Jenny does.
The one I'm most worried about is a really old oak.
Is it a red oak?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's another oak, there's a maple, there's a nice hemlock. I think a lot of trees for a tiny property. And it's a very small lot, so they're very close to
Okay. I do have a feeling you might have done the circumference. 80 inches in diameter. That's a huge tree. Like I think that's like a state record.
You may be correct about that. I did the circumference.
Okay.
So that, those would have to be divided by 3.14.
Mhm. So that takes the critical root zone down quite a bit.
For each of those trees, they would still be within the critical root zone because they're all
Okay.
within 10 feet of the property, correct? Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Well, I'd like to speak directly to Mr. Nguyen. A passionate presentation, but very concise. I am so glad to hear your viewpoint, and I think it was very well presented. And I want to say that the timeline that you included was just a truckload of work, but very, very helpful to me. You mentioned being time pressured with the HPC deadline. Yes, I'm a little time pressured too. I tried to review all this stuff in the time that I had available with house guests until yesterday, and this is complicated. There are a dizzying number of interests, but you've done such a fabulous job of laying them out, and clearly you all are very well intentioned. I'm very appreciative of your answer to Member Kerouac about what you're looking for, and you're looking for a responsible, comprehensive, constructive, supportive process, one that allows you to come forward and raise these issues. Glad to have a clarification on the 80, because, extending that root zone 80 feet from Jenny Bartold's property and into the Helly's property means you're on the public sidewalk on the other side of the house. It's just an enormous number. But I have seen surveys that do include trees outside the property line, but I didn't think it was typical, actually. I would think this is something the village should be able to do and should know to do. Lake County has a great mapping system. It's really fascinating. It's amazing how many structures are on somebody else's land. We should be able to solve trees. There are ways to protect trees during construction and to nurture them, feed them. Tim actually is an expert on this, so thank you for getting to the bottom of that. But I did want to go to the beginning of your presentation. Yes, some of these actions can be characterized in various ways, unless we all like egg on our face. You know, everybody in the room, I think, probably can find something to work on here. We did get a description of things that maybe went wrong early with the village. I wondered, there was only one reference to subdivision, in July, and I thought, oh, so yes, of course, they did rush to get something in on July 17th. I would be saying, oh, let's see, could be 6 weeks to get on the calendar at HPC, then 90 days plus 120 days, holy smokes, this house isn't going to be shelled in until spring if I'm lucky. I'd be in panic at that point, because we know when the weather happens, we know how long it takes to do these things, so we can call it a rush to force the village to make a decision, but, it's just in the nature of the business. And again, the characterization, Drew gave us a very good description how if things go ad hoc quickly. I would expect the village to be asking for more things. I would be expecting the village to ask for more clarification. So, information is really pretty skinny. It says something should be done about the dust. We saw it up there. That's really not a best practices hazardous materials management plan, which you probably think is, 1,500 words at a minimum. It's just a note on a drawing. So the note on the drawing was very skinny information compared to what you as a neighbor would like. And again, this is a place where work should be done. And while Drew's description was very ad hoc, I think the village does need to keep going back and forth and trying to address interests. And it can't all be complete at once in the beginning before you start to have the conversation. We have to see what works out, and something has to be worked out for the adjacent trees. We all value our oaks so much. Please plant more. I'm a very enthusiastic volunteer for Lake Bluff Open Lands. I was on this board when the tree ordinance came through. That is a species that we all love, we all cherish, and there are severe penalties for damaging a tree, for goodness sakes, and I don't mean that you mean to. It's just in the nature of this project that it's difficult. The house that you're demoing is next to the lot line, and it's part of the devaluation of the existing, but cherished old home that it's very poorly sited. No matter how much money you put into this house to try and preserve it, you just wouldn't get it out. It's not the way people want to live. People want a backyard. It's unfortunate, some of the aspects of this house. The lot lines were probably drawn around it at one point. At least the house is in your lot and not on somebody else's lot. There's all kinds of things that happen in the homes that are this old. So I'm very impressed that I'm not getting any expressions of bad feelings from the group that has done such a good job watching this process through. You've obviously been diligent in trying to figure out the most constructive way to approach it. And there's a ton of work to be done here, but I think the essential questions tonight were, are we hearing appeal, which we do seem to be. I mean, in our document, there seemed to be a question of whether we should even be hearing an appeal, but we are. And the question then is it complete? Does the clock start? I'm a little confused about that still, but, there's been lots of documentation. So, maybe we need to talk more about the completion, because that's really what we're charged with here, though everything else is way more interesting, really, the things you've highlighted here, the things that go wrong in the process, the way that you might expect the village to be working for you, but the village is also working for the person trying to build a house. We're all trying to work for something constructive. We have different views of how that would shake out, but I think we have to get to whether the application is complete at some point in time, and I'm not totally sure what to say about that. Information is very, very skinny. It's not what you would expect as a resident in the neighborhood.
Okay. I just want to make, again, a couple of comments. One of them is, I'm disturbed by something Mr. Nguyen said about the standing. And what disturbs me about that is that the neighbors have the ability, from what you said, to determine what kind of a home the Helleys built. And I use this example a lot. In 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright built the Roby House on the University of Chicago campus. If you've ever been down there and seen that building, It has absolutely nothing to do with the Gothic campus buildings around it. Yet, it turns out to be one of the most famous buildings in the entire world. So, the point is, I don't think it's anybody's right to begin to dictate what a homeowner can do. They can make suggestions, they can say, gee, we wish you wouldn't do that. But to say you have standing in that is very, very troublesome to me. And so, you know, we didn't even talk about that issue of standing. I know that it's something I don't quite understand. The other thing is to put a little different timeline on this. Now, again, I said I don't know where the Halleys are with their plan, but when they develop something, assuming that the village board does the second reading on Monday night of the historic preservation recommendation for the home, let's just say, and there's no reason that they won't go ahead with that. Once the Halleys come up with a plan based on the fact that now that is a designated home, they are required to bring it back to the HPC. So there's some time frame in here that is, I don't know what your time frame is, but this is going to go a long way. And you know, I practiced architecture for 40 years. I've been a registered architect for 50 years. So I know something about what I'm talking. I've probably done $3 billion worth of buildings, not residential. I'm just making that up. But anyway, a lot of big stuff. And a lot of things don't get dotted until you get there. The T's don't get crossed until you get there. But they do happen. They do get done. And so I can understand how something sort of, I wouldn't say gets pushed down the road, but gets overlooked, or we will get to it. Now, in this case, some of the things we didn't get to it, but we are to it now, I think. And so I don't know that, well, that's it. I don't know what the next step is now. Is there any?
The next step is up to you, is that if there's more information that you need, you can certainly ask it. Whether it's about the code and the various legal issues, if it's, you want to deliberate and see if you have a consensus and can formulate a motion. Ultimately, in the end of this process, you would be taking a vote on the appeal and formulating findings, however you want them to be formulated, because they're your findings. So there's been 2 different drafts of findings that have been presented to you. You are free to modify those in any way that you see. So it's up to you all on deciding if you have the consensus, if somebody wants to make a motion, and then ultimately in the end, you will all vote on it.
I need to be clear on what the appeal would mean one way or the other. Just in simple terms.
Okay.
Is there such a thing?
So the appeal has been whether or not that the demolition permit application has been complete. So you could find that it is not complete. That is one option. If that were to occur, that would be the decision. And what does that mean? Well, under the village code, there's a couple different provisions, both of which I think have been in the materials for you. One of which is, let me just pull them out so that way that is under section 9-1-18, significant demolition applications, subsection H5A. There's a 90-day review period. The Historic Preservation Commission shall have 90 days after the application completion date to receive applications for landmark nominations for the building or structure that is subject to the significant demolition application. Nomination application shall be filed pursuant to the historic preservation procedures contained in this title. So that's the first provision. I will point out that the original portion of the structure the property was nominated by the HPC. The HPC recommended that the original part, what they believed to be the original part of the structure, should be landmarked. The village board took that up and on first reading approved the landmarking of that, and will go back to the village board at its next meeting for a second reading and final approval on the landmarking. So under that provision, if you were to find that the application is not complete, I don't think anything would happen because it's already been nominated. The other provision of the code at issue, I apologize while I pull it up.
And can you explain what the landmarking designation, when you're done, means to this, then, this process, and the demolition, extent, and all that?
Okay, well, that's the next provision I was going to get to.
Okay,
If
thank you.
If a property is landmarked, so when a property is landmarked, and somebody submits a demolition application, it then goes to the HPC for advisory review, in a period in which the property owner works and consults with the HPC over various ways, whether it be the property could be saved, or portions of it, or what may be the eventual desirous outcome. And the property owner, it can also walk away from that process under our code. They're not required to go through the entire process. So that's kind of how it would play out once it's landmarked.
When they walk away from that process, what does that mean to the property?
A demolition permit would be issued, and they would be able to demolish in the.
So the landmark has no standing if they don't accept
It's
it? It
strictly a
can't,
time frame delay.
but it's not
To
a,
reach the end of the line, so,
In the village, we do not have if once landmarked, there's not a provision in our code that says you are not permitted to demolish the property.
okay.
It's not, but it does set up this process of going through advisory review. So,
I'd like to go back and make a different suggestion. The ordinance requires us to make a decision. It does not require us to make findings. It says the architecture board must issue a written decision. It seems to me the question here tonight is whether or not we approve the appeal or we do not approve the appeal. As far as stating in the proposed findings and decision, we would be making a statement about whether or not the appellant's had standing, whether or not the appeal is moot, whether or not the demolition permit is complete. I don't think we should get involved in any of that. I think we should simply say, we either deny the appeal or we accept the appeal, and that's it. I don't see any reason to get into any of the rest of that. And then the rest of the project and the process and the HPC and the village board can proceed as they do.
Wow.
I could go along with that quite nicely, but I don't know. Is that legal? Are we able to do that?
the decision is yours. So you would be able to draft any decision that you think is best. Now, that said, it would be my recommendation that whatever way you go, that you explain the reason, and that, in that way, it's clear to whether, it's the residents of the village who are interested in why you made that decision, as well as if there is an eventual lawsuit that could be brought against the village by the appellants, or somebody else, or the property owner, or, anybody else tries to bring it, your reasoning at least is laid out. But it is ultimately your decision, one way or the other, of what you want to put in there, how much you want to say, how little, and what issues, whether it's a standing, a mootness, completeness, it is entirely your call on what you want to be in that decision.
Can I ask Drew another question then, just
Well-
for this? Or are we done with the
Oh,
questioning?
the one question I did not finish answering, if you don't mind.
Yep.
So I mentioned that there were two provisions that deal with completeness of an application. The other provision is 9-1-18 H6, which talks about permits for significant demolitions, which states, except as provided in some section H7 of this section with regard to public safety emergency permits, a permit for a significant demolition application shall not be issued until the latter of, 1, the expiration of the period of time for receipt of a landmark nomination application by the Historic Preservation Commission as set forth in subsection H5A of the section, or the final 2, the final disposition of a landmark nomination pursuant to this title. So in your materials, the appellants indicated that they thought that they believe that if the application is not complete, then the demolition permit cannot be issued, and that period would continue to run. You know, as I read the code, in the way I would interpret it, is if it is landmarked, then you go through that advisory review period, and that provision of the code becomes inapplicable. But that's the other provision that would deal with completeness. And I think that was spelled out by Mr. Nguyen and the other appellants in their reply, which was provided to you. But that's the two ways it would come up in our code.
So the landmark status overrides, kind of just shuts down all the other running dates, and you start from that point then and ignore what has, those other running, you know, the 120-day review. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
That-
right, so there's the first, there's the 90-day period before the HBC, which can be extended for 30 more days. So that's where the 120 comes from.
Right.
And that period is the period in which one of the nominating parties can nominate a structure or a property for landmark status. Now, that said, you don't need a demolition permit application in order to nominate a property. A property can be nominated at any time. In this situation, the property has been nominated already, and so that, you know, that's already run. So what I should say was whether it's completed running or not under that provision, it's been nominated, and now it goes to the village board, which is where it sits now. As I said, they've approved landmark status on first reading. They'll do it on, you know, on second reading. They will have a vote to officially designate it a landmark at the next meeting.
So if this appeal was granted, does that landmark status get negated and the process starts over again? Or it's still, it's gonna be landmark? So it has nothing to do with that?
It has nothing to do with impacting whether it's landmarked or not. And again, you don't need to have a demolition
Right.
application on file to have it
But if you do,
nominated.
it doesn't, it
Right, it
runs
will have no
concurrently,
impact.
or- Can I ask Drew one question? Is that?
Yeah.
Has anything changed in the demolition application since September 28th?
No.
No new information, not one piece of new information? So it's solely a matter of the quality of the information submitted now, is what we're looking at?
Yes.
Like, is that a thorough enough site management plan?
Did they satisfy the
Right.
requirements of the code?
Are those thin
Right.
words enough to
Yeah.
satisfy?
To meet,
Right.
satisfy the code in terms of addressing the requirements for an application.
Right. Sure.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm still inclined to keep it simple.
I'm okay with that.
Do we have any other obligations under adverse impacts? You know, I mean, should we be anticipating things? I guess I got stuck on the trees. You know, I'm thinking we had a microburst a handful of years ago, and 5 oaks got topped in my yard, you know, so that the top of some enormous trees came down exactly west to east. So Jenny Barthold's tree will be in the Holly's living room. Do we have an obligation? Do we think about that? You know, is that something that needs to be addressed at this stage, or Is that just in the natural process of the building permit process? You look at the site management plan, you say, too skinny, do this, do this, do this, do this? I mean, how do the neighbors' considerations that are not encompassed by this process ever get answered? What are the adverse impacts that should be addressed in completeness?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, you raised a lot of questions. I mean, one thing to consider is, I mean, some of those impacts could be from new construction. You know, if there's an addition that's going on in conjunction with this demo, it's a little hard to address all those questions today, you know, when we don't even know who the contractor is, what the plan is, what they're building, all that. As well as, you know, the whole issue of, you know, if a microburst is toppling a tree, I mean, to what extent that related to construction or not. So I'm not quite sure
Yeah,
where
that
to
the
go with
completeness of information is
Right.
the essential question, so.
I think you can only take the tree protection so far. You can have an oak tree 200 feet away, and 10 years later, it'll die because something changed. That's all it is something changed. Also, the tree survey should talk about the condition of the tree and the age of the tree.
But
If
this is on
anybody
someone
looks
else's
around
property.
town now, we have got, I've lost 4 trees that were over 100 years old. I had last weekend, when we had big winds, I had a 60-foot tree of my neighbor's come through my yard, do a lot of damage. Just because it's an old, beautiful tree, but it was an old maple, and it just quit. So, you know, there's only so much you can do about tree protection. I mean, here's our tree guy down here. Am I right, Tim?
Yeah, but you can do things, I mean, and then say you change the level of the soil by an inch, that'll completely affect the tree. It might be 5, 8 years down the road, you'll see the effects, but, you know.
But they also
You-
just get old, you know.
They do.
They have a lifespan just like we do.
Yeah, who are you calling old?
Yeah. Have there been other instances where neighbors have looked at site management plans
I
of adjoining properties?
I
that you know
can't
of?
recall a specific one off the top of my head, but I would think there
Yeah.
probably has been at some point.
And are they afforded the right to look at a building plan and start making comments on, like, architectural drawings of the house to determine something is to code or not, or up to their standards?
They don't have the right to look at interior floor plans unless it's submitted as a zoning application or an HPC application, you know, public process.
But they have
can
the
look at
right
the
to-
exterior site plan or
They have the right to
elevation
view
or-
this because it's an exterior.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Well, wait a minute. They have the right to look at it. They don't have the right to demand changes.
That's what I'm,
And
like, who's the
that's-
expert? I'm trying to
that's
determine
then-
if
yeah.
you're allowing them to be experts on the project.
Yeah.
Which is a scary thought to a fellow architect.
Right.
I just want to make sure where we are with the village
And
and,
that was my whole question about the issue of standing,
right.
which we really haven't addressed, and I don't think we need to get into it, do we?
That is up to you. I'm not trying to be coy, but
Right.
it's
You're an
a,
attorney. You ask a
Right.
question,
but
you
it-
get a question back.
right. I'm not trying to be coy, but, you know, I think that we presented to you,
Yes, you did.
our analysis. The appellant presented theirs. If there's specific questions, I'm happy to answer them if you would like to discuss that issue. But again, it's your deliberation on where you want to go. What issues do you believe, you know, it's your decision.
Well, I don't think that anything that we would say about standing or not standing would have anything to do on what the Hillies would end up doing on their piece of property. That's my opinion.
Well, I'll make a motion then. I'd like to say to Mr. Wynn and the neighbors that I thought your presentation was excellent. I think your research is excellent. However, I mentioned my comments earlier, so I move that the appeal be denied.
Okay, a second on that motion?
So what I would recommend is, so if you want, I guess would be to handle this in kind of 2 ways, because you do need a written decision. So if that's the motion, or if there's consensus on that, you know, if we can take a 5-minute recess, and we can quickly produce to you a written decision that has that, and then you'd be voting on the written decision.
Do we see if that's a consensus before we do that?
If others agree.
Okay. Okay. Tim, what do you think?
Nay.
What does that mean?
I don't agree with the,
Oh, okay. Matt,
Yay.
Carol?
I'm frankly undecided. I'm trying to find the merits in the appeal. And I'm still struggling.
Can we have discussion after this? In public? About why? Okay.
I guess I'm with Carol. I also am undecided at this time.
That's strange, isn't it?
You know, it seems to me that what this has done is pointed out some flaws. And maybe they were one-time flaws, maybe they were small flaws, maybe they were not so small flaws, depending on your point of view. But it's pointed out some flaws, which what you're saying is in the process of being fixed. That's an important issue, I think, whichever way this goes. So we'll take our 10-minute recess? Or do we need to discuss this more so you can get off
Yeah,
the fence?
Maybe we can talk about that in public, and then
Yeah,
if we...
yeah, let's do that.
yeah.
What I find is that as of September 28th, and what has been presented as a complete packet, does fulfill the obligations. To have lay people view a site management plan and deem it professionally appropriate or not, I find is the wrong precedence here. Of course, there's things that are missing because it's not a complete packet, and we should depend on the experts that will be. I know when we do this, we have the fencing is reviewed by the village before we start. All of these elements that aren't spelled out, to the letter, will be taken care of during the process, and that's what we depend on the professionals to do, and that's part of the process. So to be able to take a document and to just keep nitpicking at it because it doesn't fulfill is a very scary proposition to me that a community can do to a personal homeowner. I find that not, and that we have to depend on the process to protect the rights of our neighbors, which is all of this is. Most of this is to protect water management. I go through this every day with my projects, and the biggest part of our projects is to ensure that the new water isn't running off or maintaining things. And it's not up to the neighbors to determine that. It's up to the village engineers, the arborists. So I find the precedence of community or neighbors deeming something to be fulfilled or correct is the wrong precedence that we're setting here, that we can start judging projects. We could stall every project because I could find something probably incorrect or incomplete in every set of drawings. That's just the nature of humans doing this process. But during the project, everything is done correctly. That's why we have permit inspections, it's part of the process of building and demolition. I don't think that should happen beforehand by the public. That's a scary proposition.
May I say something?
Sure.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Renee Boyle, and I live at 402 East Prospect Avenue. I also own a home at 345 East Sheridan Road, and that home is located in between two teardowns. I currently am still having water damage. I've dealt with arborists. They cut down trees without a permit. I am sitting here because what you're saying, neighbors absolutely should not have to be policing this. Why should I be here for probably my 5th meeting? Because I've had a pond in the lot next to me with small children and duck with no fence. I'm frustrated. And I think I have cause. That's what I'm understanding from this meeting with the drainage I have from the large home built to the east of me. And I understand property owners' rights. And I also do think I should have some standing as far as damages without having to sue my next-door neighbor for lack of follow-up or bad design plan that was signed off. So that's what I feel. I don't want to be a nosy neighbor, and I don't want to find out the house is being demolished about a week and a half before I receive notice. I just don't think that's what we're all trying to achieve here. And Drew said it wasn't complete, so why not just say it wasn't complete on the 28th, use that as a date, and move on? I mean, it's not complicated. We're all neighbors.
If I could say something briefly, Matt, to address what you said, is we're not challenging, I'm not challenging the substance of any of these. I have no basis to do that. I'm not an architect. What I'm challenging is, were they complied with at all? And so one of the things that you saw in our appeal and in our reply, based on, again, a FOIA request that I received, was that no determination was made on 7 or 8. We need to have a determination made, and it needs to be made consistent with the code. I'm not questioning the substance of that determination. I wouldn't have a basis to do that. And I don't think any of us here are asking to do that because none of us have that expertise. We're just asking that that determination be made so that the application can be deemed complete.
It's not in there. I went to the internet and put it, because it wasn't there.
Can somebody point to that again? I've lost it.
Which one?
What Mr. Nguyen is talking about,
7 and 8?
7 and 8.
I guess I would like to point out that I went to the village code on the internet and printed it out because neither of the lawyers involved bothered to give us a copy of it.
I actually did.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, I sent it to you.
Probably in here. It's in our memo. It's a lot of paper.
Yeah, the excerpts were in, they're in their they're in the memo from Ben Schuster.
Well, they were in there as excerpts. They weren't
Yeah.
in there as printed
Well,
for the code.
yeah,
There's a difference there.
okay.
Excerpts can leave things out.
So just for clarification's sake, again, September 28th was the date the application was deemed complete, so just for clarity.
Again,
Yeah.
so we have 15 days to figure this out, but we only meet once a month.
So
I would like to do this not before we go home, if we can. So Drew, you think 7 and 8 is covered?
Yes, I do. And again, in terms of satisfying the application requirements, this is not a permit, this is application requirements, yes.
Okay.
I can review those again.
I hate to belabor this, but those are not complete, and it's based on the village attorney's position. The position in their brief is clear. They say as to 7 and 8, it's up to, it's limited by what is put in the application, and that the building commissioner is foreclosed from considering any other impacts that are not in the application. So to say that that's had a review of what other impacts are is not correct, and it's not consistent with the village attorney's position with regard to 7 and 8.
I could probably come up with a list of 100 things that could be impacted as the process goes on.
I'd like to say, I think that mischaracterizes our position, and that's not exactly what the position that we took. On section 7, It says a description of site-specific measures or features not otherwise required in subsections D1 through D6 of the section proposed to minimize adverse impacts of the proposed demolition activities of the neighboring properties, public facilities, and public and private utilities and property. The provision, I would point out, does not state that it must include each and, something addressing each and every eventuality, possibility of an adverse impact. It says, what it says is that you have to have a description of site-specific measures or features not otherwise required in subsections D1 through D6 of the section proposed to minimize adverse impacts on the proposed demolition activities.
Ben, that's not correct. And let me have everybody turn to page 7 of your motion to dismiss. And I want to start with the first full paragraph. And so we don't have to read the whole thing because it's been a long night. I can represent to you that that paragraph deals with section 9118D7, which is requirement number 7. Let me read to you the last three sentences of that paragraph. The owner provided as part of the demolition site management plan information about how he planned to minimize the adverse impacts on the retention wall on the adjacent property. Further, this section only requires what is proposed by the applicant. If the applicant proposed nothing, the application could still be complete, even though that might give the building commissioner the right to deny the demolition permit.
I think you just explained why I proposed that we keep things simple and ignore both of the attorneys' proposed documents.
Would you state your proposal again, Neil?
He just said,
I think it wasn't seconded, but I move that we deny the appeal.
Drew, can I ask you a question? Does this,
And it's based on, I guess if you want it to be based on something, it's based on that the application was complete on September 28th.
does this submitted site management drawing meet industry standards or building standards that you have received in your last 10 years?
Like I said, we didn't treat or interpret the codes differently.
Right.
And in my opinion, as a building commissioner, they satisfy the code.
But this isn't substandard to any other
This
application?
is typical.
It's
This is very typical.
Of what you've.
Yes,
Right.
for applications, yes. Mike, you review, and
Yes,
you've been
I
doing
agree.
this longer than, how many years have you been doing this, Mike?
26.
26 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think that's what we're judging here, right, is the quality of this document.
The
Since
completeness.
it's number
The
7 and number 8,
completeness.
the
Yes.
completeness of,
Yes.
that's everything here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's remarkably unsatisfying. I want to put some of that circular logic to work somehow, and it's not happening.
Yeah, but this is industry, I submit these all the time. This is industry standard for what is submitted. You're basing a specific, someone's interpretation of what it should be, not based on any other history besides their own personal experience with this property.
I think that they probably should have showed the trees that are going to be, close to the property line.
Yeah, I've never, in all mine, and I work with this,
Yeah.
I've never seen an adjacent property tree line be protected on any of these site development plans. And I think it's an interesting thing, and I like it. It's a good
I mean,
practice.
because this is so different. It's
Yeah,
so-
it's a
they're
good practice, but it's
So
not,
close to the.
it's
the
not
line.
standard. If this was the only one that I've ever seen that didn't have it, maybe they're standing, but I've never seen adjoining property trees being part of the survey. That's what unfortunately, that's my.
I will tell you on certain specific projects at time when we have all information for a new building permit related to new construction, and if we identify something in the field when we go on and review it, then we say, hey, this is an issue you need to address at permit issuances when we address those.
I'm talking about
For
this
an-
stage.
For an application,
Right. And I'd have to say, this is above and beyond what a lot of municipalities require for demolition of a property. We don't usually have to submit this level of detail. Not that negates this, I'm just saying
Right,
this
right.
is, we're not under, I don't think our process is minimizing the impact. I think we're doing good with at least requiring this first it's kind of like above concept, right? But it's not final, correct? It's intent.
Permit is final.
Right, this is more intent.
This is application.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm done asking questions. I've asked a lot.
Well, if we're not finding the information incomplete, that points a direction.
That's right.
Julie, any further comments?
Well, going through it and these final discussions, I feel as though where we're at is that I feel as though it's complete as well. So that's what I will work with, is that I feel as though the application is complete as of September 28th.
And you're saying the same thing?
Yeah, I think we're there.
Neil, I'm not going to ask you. Tim, you think it's complete as of September 28th?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
I have a question. Ben, when you say you really would like to get some findings in writing, in what way would this need to be fleshed out? Would you want us to append some comment about our frustrations, or are you talking
No.
about points of law, or?
So generally, when there's an appeal, whether it's to the PCZBA, whether it's to this body, any municipal body, our recommendation is that your determination explain why you're making that determination. That said, it's yours. If you want to keep it very, very simple, that is that's within your prerogative, and you can do that. So, you know, that is your decision.
We could say that the appeal is denied because the application was complete on September 28th. And that would be the whole statement.
And so what I would suggest is based on that, I have here, I've cut down a very, very, very brief proposed decision here. Mike, if I email this to you, would you be able to print out copies for everybody?
Yeah, I could do that.
Okay, and then you can see what I have here, and then you can modify it, you can add to it, you can subtract to it, but something to work from based on what you've been saying.
Yeah, I'm proposing not going that far because I think there's too much legalese in there that's beyond the expertise of anybody
Well,
on this commission.
That's not in here, so it was based on your comments.
You want to read
so-
it to him,
I
Ben?
can read it too, I just
Why
want
don't you try that?
Yeah, so basically, it's just the heading, decision of the Lake Bluff Architectural Board of Review and the appeal regarding the application for a significant demolition permit for 419 East Prospect Avenue. The Village of Lake Bluff Architectural Board of Review hereby makes the following decision with respect to the appeal filed by, and then I name all the appellants, challenging the determination of the village's building commissioner that the demolition permit application filed by the owner of 419 East Prospect Avenue on September 28, 2018 was complete. In connection with the appeal, the ABR was confronted with whether the demolition permit application is complete. With respect to the issues presented, the ABR considered the evidence presented, including the applicable village code provisions and the various arguments of the parties, and based on such evidence and arguments, makes the following decision. The demolition permit application submitted by the owner of the property is complete and satisfies the requirements of the village code. Conclusion. Based on the facts that the building commissioner's determination was correct, the ABR has found that the appeal should be dismissed and there is not a sufficient basis for reversing the building commissioner's determination.
I think that's.
Is it possible to add something in there like logic that says, at least my logic, that the development of that application over a period of time was not handled in the best way. But, you know, how, and I'm trying to think of what I mean here, that the things get remedied by the way the village is determining their processes. That's really awful wording, but maybe you know what I mean. And that's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know if we should, I think Carol's point, judging what happened before September 28th, even though it's the most frustrating thing for you guys, and I totally appreciate that level of frustration, and then the lack of trust of the village, I get that. But our job isn't to judge what happened before the 28th. Our job is to judge if the application was complete as of the 28th. That's it, not what led up to
You're
that,
right. You're
right?
You're right.
We're not here to judge actions, we're not here to judge anything, intent. We're here to judge if the homeowners did their job and submitted a complete application, not what the village did to do that, right? Isn't that what we're here for? It's not to judge, it's not to lay blame, it's not to make someone feel good or bad.
And I certainly will tell you, we are changing how we're reviewing these, and we're also talking about how the process should get re-examined about what is required at this point in time.
Because we
So-
can't punish them for a lack of attention to detail on the village's side, right? I mean, that's not our job. Our job is simply to say, is that application complete? It seems very simple. All this other stuff is very interesting and is very enlightening and would force certain changes, which I appreciate, but it's not why we're here.
I guess I shouldn't add this, but I'm going to. I'm just surprised that a lot of you know all these steps. So for the demolition process, as far as if there should be trees or not trees, I just really hope that things get better and there is some sort of protection of the trees and the neighbors and the environment,
Yep.
and more than a dust shield. This really isn't acceptable. I mean, we can go round and round, and I'm all for change, but you have to admit that even though it's just a permit, once the permit is granted, or just the approval, things don't change that much with the permit, because it's a process, and it's hard to go backwards, and that is stated by the architects. So I just want to add in on that part of the equation, that yes, that you could everything could be done better.
Just so,
Like Bluff is starting to look a little sloppy. The construction and,
And we've had those discussions.
yes, and we will continue
Yep.
moving forward, being part of those discussions.
okay, where were we? Okay, we were on that.
So what I would recommend is if I can email this to you, print out 2 minutes, print out a bunch of copies, you all have it in front of you, you can look at it, and then a motion can be made, seconded, if there's a second, and then a vote.
Okay, yeah,
Yep.
Bruce, and email it. It takes a couple minutes sometimes to get through the server.
Okay.
So do we have a 5-minute recess then?
See who our
Would you like to move for one?
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute recess.
Okay. We can get it on our phones.
I know, I'm saying, who's our governor?
Yeah,
Change that clock.
check it out. I
Not
want
really
to
10:30.
know who George's governor is. That's what I
Who's that? George.
Where's Stacey Abrams is
Oh, is that right? Oh, George.
Georgia.
Good people. do good
Oh,
things.
those kids sat through that whole
It's
thing.
not really that late.
Should we get in, like, huddle for 5 minutes, or do you want huddle during open session?
No,
we
he
can't
was,
huddle
he
up.
was, Ben was referring to him writing this, drafting this.
Okay,
not-
so we-
not
No,
a
yeah,
private meeting.
you're
Yeah, we
gonna
can't do
you
that.
deliberate in public.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, just, thank you.
Okay, so now everybody's got this and read it. Any questions, any fill-ins, subtractions, thoughts on it? Agree with it? Disagree with it?
Do we want to say that, in the fourth section where it says the demolition permit application submitted by the owner of the property was complete as of 9/28, or is it already, you don't need to because it was already stated up above? That's all.
Yeah, it's stated twice,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Do you need to do that? Put that in there again?
We can do that. So there's no ambiguity.
As of September 28th.
Well, it's in the first paragraph, so it's not.
That's what I'm saying.
It's
I
not
don't know if it
ambiguous.
matters.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'd like to nail it down on that
So what I just
sentence.
added is, so it reads, the demolition permit application submitted by the owner of the property was complete as of September 28th, 2018, and satisfies the requirements of the village code.
Neil, it says just what you said with 200 more words.
Yeah.
Julie, what do you think?
Up here,
I'm
that's
good with
why I
it.
couldn't figure it out.
Carol,
As far as it goes, I'm good with it, yeah.
or do you want to go farther?
Okay.
Well, I think it's still dissatisfying that there were so many issues, but they're not really being addressed by this decision, so they don't really belong in this decision. Did I say that appropriately?
But some of the
Yeah.
issues.
I agree.
Yeah, we got some hanging chads here.
But that's not our
but the-
role here.
No.
I agree. Well, based on the changes the change we just made of adding the date down there into what is that, the third paragraph, is there a motion? To
So moved.
second?
I second.
Let's do a roll call, Mike.
Do we need to read this for the public to know what we're approving and all that, or did we do that already?
You read,
No, we read it, and I just read the change. You don't
Okay.
technically need to read it again,
Okay.
just like we don't read an entire ordinance at the village board level. This will be the
Okay.
written decision that you issue.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, but I actually think it's a good idea for the record on the video. I think it's a great
Happy
idea.
to read the whole thing?
Yes, please, Ben,
Okay.
so it will be recorded.
Decision of the Lake Bluff Architectural Board of Review and the appeal regarding the application for a significant demolition permit for 419 East Prospect Avenue. The Village of Lake Bluff Architectural Board of Review, ABR, hereby makes the following decision with respect to the appeal filed by H. Edward Wynn, Mary K. Wynn, Donna Hurst, Jenny Barthold, Louise Hayes, Elizabeth Condren, Stephanie Bjork, John Bjork, Ann Caldwell, and Kristen Ashley, collectively the appellants, challenging the determination of the village's building commissioner that the demolition permit application filed by the owner of 419 East Prospect Avenue, defined as the property, on September 28, 2018, was complete, the building commissioner's determination. With respect to the issues presented, the ABR considers the evidence presented, including the applicable village code provisions and the various arguments of the parties, and based on such evidence and arguments, makes the following decision. The demolition permit application submitted by the owner of the property was complete as of September 28, 2018, and satisfies the requirements of the village code. Conclusion, based on the facts that the building commissioner's determination was correct, the ABR has found that the appeal should be dismissed, and there is not a sufficient basis for reversing the building commissioner's determination.
okay.
Okay, so for the roll call vote, Member Waymire,
Aye.
Member Russ,
Aye.
Member Kerouac,
Aye.
Member Callahan,
Aye.
Member Dahlman,
Aye.
and Chair Hunter.
All right,
It is 6-0. Motion passes.
thank you all.
one question I have for the board members on another topic before we adjourn. We don't have any applications in yet for our December meeting, but I understand the meeting date is at the same date as the caucus night. And so that presents a conflict. I'm just wondering how many people might miss for that.
I'll be gone.
You'll be gone.
I'll be gone.
Neil will be gone. But the others of you would likely be okay with
something to
having
do.
the meeting that night?
You all should attend the other meeting.
The caucus?
Caucus is 2 nights, Tuesday
Yeah.
and Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
As of right now, I'm in town, but I might have to travel either the week before or that week, so.
Okay, okay. Well, we don't necessarily need to move it then. We'll wait and see whether we get an application for that meeting and
I've got a
maybe
question
we'll
for you.
stick to that date.
The house on Sheridan that
Mhm.
Emerald is doing, we
Mhm.
talked about this about a month ago.
Right, yeah.
And the siding is still not on it. It's a huge eyesore.
Well, yeah, I actually had a good meeting, myself and the village engineer, with the new superintendent for Emerald Homes. They've had a few people change, they've had a couple superintendents leave, but they've got a new guy in charge now. And I believe they're just getting their IDOT permit now to do their water connection. And
He's got to put siding up. You
well,
said
you
that.
know, I did say that, but I take it back now after talking to him. He explained that, you know, the hardy board will sometimes, the house will move a little when you hang the drywall on the inside, and the lines will no longer look straight and crisp if you put the siding on first and hang the drywall later. So he explained why they like to hang the drywall first. And know the wall's not gonna distort anymore and put the siding on last.
I'm doing a project now where they refuse to do stucco because when you nail in the drywall, it's gonna crack the stucco, so they're crazy. Everybody's crazy. The industry's crazy right now.
Right,
Everybody's
yeah.
protecting themselves left and right, so I feel no sympathy or for anybody doing anything because it's all bad out there.
Right.
So I've never had a situation where someone said the hardy board can't take some nailing of studs. I mean, that seems
He was
very
saying
odd.
that the weight of the drywall on it could distort
It's not on it.
the wall.
Yeah,
Well, I
that
know, it's
seems
on
a
the
very
side.
strange
Yeah, right,
situation.
Yeah,
I truly,
Yeah.
the project's not that bad.
yeah.
It's concrete. It doesn't, right? The whole
Right,
thing of
yeah.
concrete, there's no compression. It's all
Right,
tension.
Right,
That's a crazy solution, or,
Okay.
yeah,
Thing.
but anyway, that's what they say.
is that on the record?
But anyway, they're moving along with that. I think they're getting their IDOT permit, and he's
Okay.
moving along with
We haven't
addressing some
adjourned,
things
have
on
we?
the site.
Did
All
we
right.
adjourn?
Well, then, thank you,
Not yet.
Ben.
Did you
Would
adjourn?
someone like to make a motion?
I moved to
Motion to
adjourn.
adjourn.
Thank you. All in favor of going?
Aye.
Aye.
Here you go. Recycling.
Okay, thanks.